Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood?
Before we begin tonight, I would like to make mention to remember that this Wednesday evening we'll be having a Thanksgiving prayer service. And so all the classes and everyone will meet in the auditorium. And then, of course, Thursday morning or Thursday at noon will be our Thanksgiving meal. And everyone is invited to become part of that. And there is that sign-up sheet on the back if you have not had an opportunity to sign up yet. It was in the 1970s that American psychic to the stars Jean Dixon, which some of you may remember, became famous when a few of her predictions came true, including, by the way, her 1956 prediction that in the 1960 election a Democrat would win the presidency and then be assassinated before his term was completed. Of course, in 1960, she adjusted that prediction and said that Nixon was going to win the presidency, and that was just chalked up to one of her many thousands of predictions which did not come true. She herself was a devout Catholic, and she once declared that the Antichrist has been born and is growing into maturity. That at some place in the world today, the Antichrist now exists, having been born sometime in the 70s, and is growing to maturity and will one day take power and lead the world into its utter tribulation and destruction. The 16th century prognosticator Nostradamus likewise had hundreds of cryptic predictions that if you squinted really hard and stood on your left foot and held your tongue just right, they would almost make sense possibly to apply to some far distant possible meaning of some event that might have happened somewhere in a shadow of a way. And yet people look to him and follow many of his predictions with great affinity. And he once stated that the third Antichrist, very soon annihilated, 27 years his war will last, the heretics are dead and captives exiled. Now, if those batch of words don't make a lot of sense to you, none of Nostradamus' words make a lot of sense. They're hodgepodge and thrown together, and yet the one or two that we like to, in hindsight, apply to certain events in year or that have happened, we say, well, look, he was quite the predictor. But you know, this just kind of shows the intrigue with the Antichrist theory and how it plays heavily into the end of times discussion, especially among those who are evangelicals of the dispensational theology. When you start talking about Antichrist, people's ears perk up. It was George Bush, it was Barack Obama, it was Adolf Hitler, it was Mussolini. We have all kinds of theories about who was the first Antichrist and who was the second Antichrist and who is the third Antichrist. We were reminded of movies like Rosemary's Baby that struck terror in our minds as it related back to the Antichrist. Oh, the Antichrist. And yet the false prophecies of Jean Dixon and of Nostradamus show that they are just that, themselves false prophets. The Left Behind series dramatized the Antichrist as the Nikolai Carpathian, and he was the worst of the worst, the dreaded one he was a smooth, charismatic individual that would usher in sin and tribulation. Let me tell you something. The theories about Antichrist are much more grandiose than what the Bible actually describes. In fact, most of the ideas that surround the Antichrist and his terror or his terroristic reign are actually from the false prophecies of people like Jean Dixon and Nostradamus and the writings of Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. They do not have a root in what the Bible actually says. So tonight I want to take some time and actually look, and we'll have time to do this, we'll look at all the scriptures that talk about the Antichrist, all 5 of them. And they're all from John. not the book of John, but the Apostle John in his 1 John and 2 John. He is the only one that makes reference to the Antichrist. So let's spend some time looking at this idea. Well, first of all, before we actually get into the reading of the text, let's understand what Antichrist means. It's the Greek word, antichristo. It's just a transliteration of that word, and it's made up of the word Christ, or Christos, which means anointed one. And we know and understand that to be a direct reference to Jesus, the Messiah, or the Christ. He is the Christ. And so anything that we're going to talk about with the Antichrist, it has reference first and foremost to the idea of the Christ himself. And so it has the prefix of anti in front of it, which we get in our English language means against. To be a anti-administration or anti-disestablishmentarianism or anything. The anti it means to be against something. And in the Greek, it means to be against something. It means exactly the same thing. In fact, our English word is based upon, or our English prefix is based upon the very Greek prefix that is used here, to be against something. And so, if you put Antichrist together, it is to be against the Christ. It's a very simple meaning, but I will say that word anti is also translated as a prefix to mean in the place of something. When something is taken another's place, then it can be called anti or anti. And so it may be that the word Antichrist means not just one who is against Christ, but one who is put in the place of Christ. So that's simply all it means. It simply refers to someone who puts himself in the place of Christ or is against Christ, is working to oppose him. So let's turn in our Bibles to John chapter 2 and look at the passages, or 1 John chapter 2, 1 John chapter 2, the first letter. We'll spend some time looking at each of there's really just 3 passages. 2 of them mention the word twice, and so that we get the 5 occurrences. The first one here is in 1 John 2, beginning in verse 18. Children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard, the Antichrist is coming. And so immediately what jumps out at us is not just the word Antichrist, but what should jump out at us is this last hour, a time frame reference. We start talking about the last things, the last days, the last hours. We're talking about eschatology. We've already established that point in this entire series on the handbook on the end. And so we jump to this idea of, okay, we're talking about end times things. And that's why Antichrist comes into the discussion about the end of times. Children, it is the last hour. Now, understanding exactly what John means by that, in the rest of the New Testament, references to the last days or the last hours is a reference to the last epoch or era of time, the last dispensation. We began with the patriarchy, we moved into the Mosaical law, the time of Judaism, and then that is supplanted by the time of Christ. And so you have these 3 distinct dispensations of time, each one ushered in by a seismic shift in the world, the creation of the world. Patriarchy began. It lasted until Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, climbed Mount Sinai, received from God the commandments which were going to guide God's people, and that lasted until Christ died on the cross. Because where there is a testament, the death of the testator must take place. Hebrews 9, 15 through 17. Jesus had to die, and that ushered in the last days. Not the last few 24-hour periods, but literally the last epoch of time. John's reference to the last hours is the same reference to the last days. It's the last time. We know that it is there because you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. You've heard that those that are going to be opposed to the Messiah were going to come. And he says, John, make this very clear. And so now many Antichrists have come. I love that because it's so clear. It's not just looking forward to some one great Antichrist or the first, second, and third Antichrist, which, by the way, the only reference in history to the first, second, and third Antichrist is Nostradamus, which came about 1,500 years too late. But here, as a reference to Antichrist, he said, you've heard that when the last hours come, the Antichrist must also come. I'm telling you, the Antichrist has come. Now understand, John's emphasis here is not to tell us about the Antichrist. It's to tell us that we are in the last time. that we're in those last days, that we have entered the time in which today becomes the day of our salvation. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour. That's how we know the Antichrists are here. We know that it's the last hour. Now, they went out from us. The Antichrist went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they'd been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out, that it might become plain that they are not all of us. But you have been anointed by the Holy One, and you have knowledge. I write to you not because you do not know the truth, but because you know it, and because no lie is of the truth. Who is a liar? Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? Who stands in the role of denial but the one who looks at the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ and says, he was a good man, but he was not the Messiah. He was not the Son of God. Or to look at the life and the ministry of Christ and say, he was God, but he was not truly a man. To deny that he came in the flesh, or to deny that this man was deity, was to deny the Christ. Who is the denier? He who denies that Jesus is the Christ. This, he says, is the Antichrist. That's the Antichrist, the one who denies the deity or the humanity of Jesus Christ. He who denies the Father and the Son. When we deny the Father or the Son, that is Antichrist. No one denies the Son, or no one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. You cannot take the life and ministry of Christ, separate it from God, and say, I accept God, I just don't accept Jesus. Today, in modern theology, we refer to that as deism, that Jesus was not divine, only God is divine. In the first century, it was zealous Judaism because they refused to accept the Messiah had come. But the reflexive principle is that if you reject Christ, you reject God who sent him. But if you accept Christ, you accept God. And if you're one that stands in denial of Christ or of the Father, that is the Antichrist. So those are the first two instances of the word in the New Testament. The next two are just a couple of chapters over in 1 John chapter 4. Beginning in verse 1, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is in the world already. Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. There it is again, the idea of the Antichrist. And he starts off with, do not believe every spirit. We understand that a reference to those who were going around in the first century preaching and teaching the gospel, and John is warning them, be careful, because many false prophets have already gone out into the world and they're trying to deceive the church. So don't just believe every spirit when they come by and say, hey, I'm a spirit of God. Hey, I'm a preacher of the gospel. Don't believe them, but test them. Try them. That was one of the miraculous gifts of the first century, was the ability to discern spirits. So he says, use the gift that God has given to you. Discern those spirits, whether they are of God or whether they're not. And then he gets down here and he says, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and everyone that does not confess, what are they doing? They're denying. They're denying Christ, his ministry, his nature. This is the spirit of the Antichrist. Now, the word spirit in most translations is in italics, because that means that the translators supplied that word because it's not actually in the original. And so, when we get to this verse, this is the spirit of the Antichrist, literally reads, this is the Antichrist. What is? The spirit of denying Christ Jesus. When we deny Christ, that is the spirit of Antichrist. And he says, you've heard that he's coming and is in the world already. Now is in the world already. Little children, you're from God. And you have overcome them, for he who is in you, Christ, is greater than he who is in the world, the Antichrist. The conflict between Christ and Antichrist will not succeed because Christ is greater than the Antichrist. And then turning to 2 John in verse 7. The last reference to the Antichrist. For many deceivers have gone out into the world. Those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. And there it is again. Many deceivers. The deceivers are those who are practicing or trying to get you to believe a lie. That's what a deceiver does. So the Antichrist is one who is trying to get you to believe a lie because he says such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. They're one and the same. If he's a deceiver, he is an Antichrist. If he is an Antichrist, he is a deceiver. And he's trying to get you to believe lies about Jesus. What kind of lies? Well, specifically here, as it lines up with the first passage and with the second passage, is denying that Jesus came in the flesh. So you think about the qualities of the Antichrist. Well, according to these passages, there's more than one. There's not some great Antichrist. None of these passages are talking about the great Antichrist that was to come. It's Antichrists, plural, and they're already here. They left from the church. They went out from us, it says in chapter 2 and verse 19. They were already part of and connected to the church, but they have gone out. It refers to them as liars and deceivers. They're denying the deity of Jesus, or they're denying the humanity of Jesus. That's the Antichrist. But look at the time frame references for the Antichrist. Just in these verses, since these are the only verses that talk about Antichrist, he says it is the last hour. Now, there's some debate over whether or not that is actually talking about the last epoch of time of Christianity. Some have suggested that it is the last hours of the Jewish dispensation, tying it back to Matthew 24 and the Olivet Discourse, which we've considered already in this series, about how that was the destruction of Jerusalem. And that here is John pointing out that the destruction of Jerusalem is right up on us. The final severing between God and the Jewish Empire is right here. We are in the final hours before those events occur. I can't really come to that and say that that is definitely wrong as an interpretation. But if it's not the final throes of the Jewish Empire, it is talking about the final epoch of time in which mankind has an economy before God. And that's the church age that we live in now. But here's the thing. Whether it's right at the end of the Jewish Empire or right at the beginning of the Christian time, they're within hours of one another. And that event happened some almost 2,000 years ago. And so this idea that the futurists come in and say, there's coming a day when the tribulations will start and the Antichrist will come and things will get really, really bad. It doesn't fit in the timeline that John is talking about. In fact, not only does he call it the last hour, but in the very next verse he says, many have already come. And that's how you know it's the last hour, because they're already here. You have heard they were coming and are now in the world already. Many deceivers have gone out into the world. Past tense, they are already here. John reveals that the Antichrist is not some future being, but someone who already existed even in the first century while he was writing these letters. So, who is the Antichrist? Isn't that's the big question, right? Who is it? Well, I've got some ideas. I think when you look at John's writings, one of the things that he deals with is against Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a developing philosophy at the time that John is writing, which specifically denied that Jesus came in the flesh. Most of them looked at Jesus as either a very wise man who was not God, or that he was God but was not a man. There was one group, for example, that believed that Jesus was a spirit. When he would walk upon the sand, he left no footprints. When he was hanging on the cross, he only pretended to be hanging on the cross, but because he was not a physical body. He was a spirit. And so he pretended to hang there as an example or as a show, but it really wasn't painful. It wasn't detrimental to him. He could have just floated off the cross and into the heavens if he wanted to, because he was a spirit. John is coming in and he opens his letter and he says, that which we have seen and that which we have heard and that which we have handled with our hands, he is identifying, we know that he was a man. John says, as well as I could hold your hand, as well as I could smell you or see you or touch you, I knew that Jesus was a man. And so for people to come in and deny that, he says that is a spirit of Antichrist. And so the Gnostics denied the origin of Jesus, or they denied the deity of Jesus, or they denied the humanity of Jesus. And while the organization or the philosophy was not fully developed by the end of the first century, we know that John was already starting to deal with Gnosticism through his writings, through his letters, through the book of Revelation, even in his gospel account, is identifying that idea. And so it becomes part of the object of his refutation. John was famous one time for having been in a public building, and a man by the name of Cerinthius, who was one of the originators of the Gnostic doctrine, came into the building. And they said John ran out of the building, saying, well, let's flee the building lest it fall in on us, for Cerinthius is in there. He was an enemy of the cross. It's possible that John, in talking of the Antichrist, is talking of Gnosticism and those who were developing that philosophy. Depending on the writing, the date of the writing of 1st, and 2nd, and 3rd John, some put it as late as the 90s in the first century. Others put it as early as the late 60s, just prior to the destruction of the temple. If it's in the mid to late 60s, it's very possible that John is referring maybe to Nero, who, as you know, was one of the most vicious, vilest of men who ever occupied the Roman emperorship. He was the Caesar of Rome. He was so vile that even his own contemporaries, those who were not Christians, but those who were part of the Roman world, like Pliny the Elder, referred to Nero as a brute beast, as being wild. There were those who gave accounts of how he would dress himself. He would take prisoners and tie them to posts, and then he would put on animal skins, like a lion's skin or a bear's skin, and then he would go and viciously maul his prisoners. He was one who killed his own wife by kicking her to death. I mean, this was a vicious, vicious man. That's the kind of man he was. And it's no wonder that his contemporaries said that he was a beast. Others said that he was not human. And a lot of people tie Revelation 13 and the beast with Nero. We'll take some time and look at the mark of the beast and the beast himself later. But a lot of people that use Revelation 13 to be the beast and talk about Nero, they tie that with the Antichrist of 1 John. And by the way, with the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2, where Paul says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first." John says the last hour is coming. Well, the rebellion's got to come first. And the man of lawlessness, or the man of sin, is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. What does that sound like? I know Paul doesn't use the term Antichrist, but if Antichrist is one who opposes Christ or puts himself in the place of God or Christ, what is the man of sin doing? He opposes everything that is God, and he proclaims himself to be in the seat of God. It's the very thing that the Antichrist is doing. We see it in the man of sin. There's a restraining power, he says. There's a mystery of lawlessness that is already at work, Paul says. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of the Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deceptions for those who are perishing, because they have refused to receive the love of the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that what may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in righteousness. The similarities between John's Antichrist and Paul's man of sin, that they're already working just as the Antichrist were, that they were opposing and putting themselves in the place of God as the Antichrist does, comes by the activity of Satan. There was a mysteriousness around them, and so many put all of those together and say, look, these things point to Nero or some other wicked emperor of the Roman Empire. And maybe it does. Some have even suggested that it was the rise of the papacy, of Roman Catholicism, that was already starting to work. Paul would tell those at Ephesus, "From among your own selves men shall arise, not sparing the flock, but drawing disciples away after them." From where? From Ephesus, the elders at Ephesus. When do we see the presiding elder? It came from Ephesus. And through that congregation and through the leadership of that congregation ultimately became what we see today as the papacy. Had its fledgling starts in the first century in the church at Ephesus. I don't know if it's one of those three. But what I can tell you is from the language that John and Paul uses, either way, it cannot be some futuristic individual who's yet to be born or who was recently born and is now maturing and coming into that. That does not fit the Bible's picture of Antichrist. Isn't it amazing? These books and things that you read and you find out all the details about the Antichrist. You find out more from their fancies than you do from the Bible. They've already come. We may not know for certain who it is, but we can know who it is not. And it is not something in the future. We'll pick up more when we look at the beast and the mark of the beast later in one of our other lessons. But understand this. The coming of the Antichrist marked the last days. That last epoch of time. And that's what Paul referred to in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 1 and 2, when he said, "Today is the day of salvation." This is the time in which God opens the fountain to the nation of Israel, to all of mankind in the blood of Christ. Today is the day of salvation. This is the time that God appointed for you to obey the gospel. And if you've never obeyed the gospel, today can be your day of salvation. These last days can be the time that you've come to Him. If you've already obeyed the gospel, but you've fallen away, That's not a judgment here to say that you're a bad person or that you don't deserve it. That's just simply to say life happens to us at times and we let it pull us away from God. But God is always standing ready to welcome you home. And if tonight you're ready to repent, to fall into His arms of grace, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
And you've been to Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood